Welcome to the first session of the mini conference at DU, taking Lacan public, and also to the third session of the seminar, not the seminars of Lacan, this is the seminars of Rashka, called Theory of the Subject. So tonight we enter into Lacan. And I'm not going to talk a lot tonight. We've got our Lacanians here tonight. I want to introduce them. So our distinguished professorial guest from the Netherlands, where they don't experience any anxiety.
No, we don't.
No. That's why it's such a good place to raise kids.
We live under sea level.
Right.
Don't bother.
But you worry about global warming all the time. I know that. Who's Dr. Vesterink is he's philosophy faculty at University or Radboud University in Nijmegen, the Netherlands, which is in the southeastern part of the country. Radboud is a Catholic university former Catholic university, I should say. It's the only university in the world that I know that's ever actually been officially excommunicated.
It's like the Lacanians.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And or it's un-Catholic kind of behavior in the past and so forth. And of course, it's named after a saint that nobody knows who the saint is too. So that's very much
Very nice.
So a Catholic saint that nobody knows who it is, and it's not really Catholic, even though so you can get the picture. It's a good introduction for him. So, he is the previous General Secretary of the International Society of Psychology and Religion. He's published on various issues having to do with philosophy and psychoanalysis. His most recent book is his Routledge, called The Heart of Man's Destiny, which is sort of taking Lacan back into the 16th century and, sort of looking at all the kind of neuroses that created theology that we study today, such as predestination, what have you. So, but you can't. So I suppose you could say the book, which is a very good book, by the way, puts theology on the couch. Yeah, that's what it does. That's what it does. And then our other guest, some of you were here 2 months ago. This is Gabriela Zorzucki, who is the director of the Colorado Psychoanalytic Society for the Lacanian field, and also of the Colorado Clinical College, where the mini conference sessions were moved to on Friday. And she's also international. We have quite an international galaxy here. She's Argentinian. Netherlands, different continents, let alone different countries. So we have quite a possibility here tonight. Remember, we were saying that Kierkegaard described faith as the battle for possibility. Well, tonight we might call this the battle for impossibility. So let me start off by, here's how we're going to proceed tonight. Okay, so the first hour we're kind of going to, and those of you who are actually analysts or Lacanian psychoanalytic professionals or students of professional psychology, please just bear with us. This first hour we're going to call Lacan for Dummies, only because you've been asked to read the text, and we're going to deal with the text tonight, but you don't have a lot of context. We've been dealing with this philosophically. At the same time, we're going to shift gears a little bit tonight, and I've got a sort of agreement with our professional analysts in the room is that we're going to mediate, not in a Hegelian sense, between the philosophic or the academic and the clinical. And the clinical is actually the most interesting. If you want to read a crazy philosophy, you can read Nietzsche, read Kierkegaard, we did last week. But the first thing we do, we kind of sketch out who Lacan is, contextualize him, And I've asked Professor Vestering to do that for the first 40 minutes. And then the last 2 hours, the three of us have selected particular texts from the readings tonight, which are the first of Through the Moral Law. You know, so again, you know, last week was all about, you know, anxiety and despair, and, you know, hopefully we'll begin from that standpoint. You know, hopefully you've kind of carried your anxiety and despair from last week, because what you're contextualizing. Then we're going to be talking about specific texts and sort of go wherever it goes. That's what a Lacanian cartel means. It's sort of, it's like a Deleuzian rhizome. It kind of it goes where it grows and it grows where it goes. So that's the way the conversation, Lacan would be proud. He'd be pretty happy. You know. Some of you noticed that this is not a book. It's more like what Derrida called the end of the book. You know, this is a seminar. So you can imagine if somebody were actually transcribing everything that I do, you know, in the last 2 weeks, and made that into a book, and that became a sort of canonical text, it would probably drive students crazy, right? And I know you're all looking for order and symmetry and closure. But let me alert you and warn you, there is no order and symmetry, let alone closure tonight. It's one thing we were talking about. Herman was mentioning, he said, well, you know, psychological professionals in the United States always want a teleology of analysis. You know, I guess because, you know, they get paid by insurance to do that. You know, the question is there really isn't a teleology in psychoanalysis. You know, it's open. It's open like deconstruction is open. So anyway, so here I'm going to make 3 minutes of remarks. I'm going to turn over to Herman, then we'll take a break, and then the cartel. Yeah. So what I want to just make some remarks about is the theory of the subject. In some ways, we're really kind of digging into the question of the subject tonight in a way we haven't dealt before, even with Kierkegaard. Now, Kierkegaard problematizes certainly the Hegelian spirit, subject, spirit, and so forth. The whole notion of the relational self as spirit, and, you know, the inability to reconcile these two moments of the dialectic, you know, the irresolvable dialectic, the existential dialectic of Kierkegaard. But there's more to the question of the subject of dialectic. There's also the question of agency, which we've talked about. And just as we have a different sort of model of subjectivity in each one of these sections of the course, so we have a kind of different model implicitly operating of agency in each of these philosophers, theoreticians, and so forth. So you could say that the word for agency in Hegel is spirit, you know, or Geist. In Kierkegaard, it's relationship. You can say, and my esteemed colleagues may want to correct me tonight, and say, but I would say in Lacan it's desire. You know, Lacan, and so the question is, what does the word desire mean in terms of the whole issue of subjectivity? Well, you can't really talk in a grand philosophical way about desire. You know, desire is very concrete. Desire is very contextualized. Desire is very personal, very subjective, very intimate. You know, where the text I'll just give you a little forewarning. The text that I've chosen is the whole question of das Ding, German for the thing, that that Lacan makes a lot about in these things. You know, and there's that kind of intimacy of das Ding, you know, the intimacy, but that it's always, he says, beyond the signifier and so forth. And that's what kind of gives us desire. And desire is not something you can analyze in the same way that you can take apart something, a philosophical notion like knowledge. That desire is, you know, everything, you know, if, you know, you're looking across the room and seeing a against another person, you know, and saying, cool or hot, or you haven't get to know that person, fantasizing like I'm not saying this, just saying because I realize we're all Kantians in the room, so maybe you know, or we have pure wills, let alone, you know, impure desires. But just, you know, whatever's going on, you know, it's like you can't just philosophize about that in the way we're used to in the academic world. That's why we need clinicians, you know, and we didn't have enough couches put here in the room for everybody, so you'll have to sit in the chair, and even if you got up on the table and lay down, still, you know, take up too much room. So, but anyway, we're going to be in that modality to a certain degree. So subjectivity in terms of the agency desire, whatever that means, whatever it implies, whatever pathway that, you know, directs us toward whatever portal we go through, whatever tornado picks us up and takes us up into a psychoanalytic Oz. Turn over to Herman to sort of tell you, explain to you, he's very good at this. He's very good at sound bites. Because I've been listening to him over coffee, and
You put
pickle herring at breakfast the last 2 mornings. They eat a lot of pickle herring. And he's going to tell you why Lacan is good for you, why you should enjoy yourself.
Thank you, Carl. No, I'm not. Here the sound bites go. So what I wanted to do is actually give a kind of a historical context first for this specific seminar. And in the course of that, tell a little bit about Lacan, and the Lacanians among you will probably now close their eyes because they already know this, all this stuff. So who is Lacan and what made him Lacan? Lacan started out, first of all, you're right, by the way, it is desire. In one of the, I think it's the 6th or 8th, 7th.
Previous one.
He says, exactly, he refers to Spinoza and the Spinozian definition of the essence of man. Desire is the essence of man. And Lacan affirms this. And you were right, we talked about it very shortly. He had a big admiration for Spinoza in his younger years. He had a whole scheme of Spinoza's ethics worked out in a kind of a poster format, and had hung it above his bed so that he could watch, let's say, the whole structure of Spinoza's ethics. And there is some Spinoza in this text also. Certainly is concerned, let's say, the essence of man being desire. But Lacan did not start out as a philosopher, of course. He was a psychiatrist. I think it's always important to say where he comes from. He's trained as a psychiatrist, which is already interesting because of his whole return to Freud. Freud never was a psychiatrist. Freud not even wanted to be a psychiatrist. He wanted to conquer psychiatry because Freud thought that psychoanalysis was a proper theory, was an excellent theory and an excellent method to, let's say, contribute to the field of psychiatry. But Freud was not a psychiatrist. Lacan was a psychiatrist in the context of the French psychiatric tradition. And then in the 30s already, he becomes acquainted with psychoanalysis. He never meets Freud. And he starts off basically as a client. Right. This is always a tricky point because I once had a lecture at the Belgian School of Psychoanalysis, which is already complicated because they have 2 languages and have to translate everything for everybody. But there was a split in the room. Some people were sitting there, some people were sitting there, and I thought, well, these are the French-speaking, these are the Dutch-speaking people. But then someone explained to me, no, those are the Lacanians, those are the Kleinians, and they don't speak. It was a whole new perspective on the country of Belgium. But Lacan started out as a Kleinian. And you can very clearly see that in his early texts. His early text is on family in the 30s, but it's very much on the child-mother relationship. And on the idea, and exploring also the idea, the Kleinian notion of the devouring mother. And this theme of the devouring mother comes back in Lacan's the earliest seminars, which are on what he calls the imaginary order, which is basically about, I will not explain it in detail, but it's basically about two things, namely the relation of the child to him or herself via an image in the mirror. I recognize myself as myself in the mirror image, but that image at the same time is not me. So at the moment I identify with myself, I also see that I am someone else. Je suis, je ai. It's not je suis, je ai.
So
I is
like,
another.
I identify as another. Yeah,
As another.
in the image
Yeah.
is another.
Yeah, is another.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the imaginary order, so it's about this, let's say, moment of estrangement in the very moment that you identify yourself as yourself or with yourself. Okay? And it is about the relationship with the mother, which is a dual relationship, and which is already very much about the desire, because, let's say, a child lives in a kind of, it's not a symbiotic world that would be too perfect and too harmonized, but it is in this dual relationship with the child. The child lives in this, let's say, in this environment where its needs are provided for, but it is actually, let's say, in a sense, nothing but the object of desire of the mother. So it is everything what Freud would call Her Majesty the baby, but at the same time, it is nothing but the object of the mother's desire. There you have the devouring aspect of Klein. So that's the first Lacan, and he works it out in his first seminars from the early 50s. Then from there he proceeds towards, he has these two first seminars in the imaginary, I would then say. He writes a seminar on psychosis, which is actually quite an obvious theme for him being a psychiatrist. Just to remember or call in mind, Freud was not very much concerned with psychosis, much more with neurotic patients. So
You did incredible work with Trevor, though.
he did some work on Trevor, yeah. But from the perspective of neurotic.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah?
Yes. Yes. Of course.
And so Lacan starts to go his own way, and in, let's say, halfway the 50s, he starts to develop a series of seminars on what he would call the symbolic order. The symbolic order, and with the symbolic order, the figure of the father. The figure of the father who, let's say, liberates the child out of this dual entanglement with the mother, and provides and gives and introduces the child in the realm of language and culture. So what the father provides is language to, let's say, that the child will learn to handle, to express its own wishes, its own desires, its own, to articulate what it wants, what it desires, what it needs, everything. And of course also to articulate its own, let's say, identity. In that sense, it is a liberation, you could say, what the father does, because now the child is no longer simply, let's say, the object of the mother's desire. No, it can articulate its own desires, and by doing so, it develops an own identity, it becomes a person, or subject. But at the same time, this introduction into the realm of language and culture also means that, let's say, certain things are excluded. There is a limitation. This is why Lacan associates this function of the father as introducing the child into the realm of language and culture, both as a liberation and a limitation. From now on, certain desires are excluded. The desire of the mother, the devouring mother, but also the desire for the mother.
Can you all hear as well?
Can you hear me? Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
Are we allowed to interrupt or not?
Yeah, please do. Please do.
I just wondered if it was starting with lecture and then questions, or if we can.
No, if you want to interrupt, you can do that.
If you,
Okay,
you
good.
came in late, what we're doing is because we have a number of students in the class here that never had it's their first introduction to Lacan. We're sort of doing this sort of introductory overview of
Okay.
what Lacan is, and we asked the Lacanian specialists if they could just bear with us and be patient for the first hour.
Well, just a quick question about the father introducing the child to language and culture. Well, mothers also teach the child language and culture.
Yeah, but this is not, Lacan is not so much talking here about, let's say, the actual figures of mother and father, but more about the function that they have in let's say, the first structuring of the child's mental life. So this is why he connects the father to, so when he talks about the father, he basically talks about a function that the mother could also fulfill. So, but the function is this, there is a moment of introduction into the realm of language and culture. And it is done by the father that says no to the imaginary desires, and at the same time introduces a law, a name attached to the child that provides a first indication of identity. And from there on, the whole possibility of articulation. So that is what is happening in the symbolic. Let's say that's the function of the father.
Okay.
And actually, this text that is central in this class, in this course, the ethics of psychoanalysis, I would say marks the next step in Lacan's thought, because here he makes the move from a theory very largely concerned with the symbolic towards let's say, the introduction of what he would call the previous seminars. That was not a big issue for Lacan, but now he sees that there is something that is excluded or cannot be put in both imaginary or symbolic terms. Something that is beyond that. And he would call it here the thing. It's only in this seminar that he talks about the thing, by the way, because in the next seminars he will introduce other concepts such as the object the object little a, would that be the correct?
We said petit a.
Petit a, the petit a. This is also the seminar where he introduces the concept of jouissance, which will be a very important concept in all of later Lacan's writings. Not always with the same meaning, we don't have to discuss that. So you see there is a line, imaginary order to do relationship with the mother, then towards the function of the father, the symbolic order, and then towards, let's say, that's where I want to, let's say, that's the first
All
sketch.
that happens together, yeah?
And then,
Like we do this separation for the didactic purpose,
Yeah.
but all that happens intertwined.
no, that's correct. Yeah. But for the didactic purpose,
Yeah.
try to make
To
this
clarify.
distinction. And then there is, so that is a first, let's say, indication of the context of this text. There is another one, a more historical one, a more, let's say, political one, that has to do with Lacan's, let's say, struggles with the International Psychoanalytic Association.
I'm glad you're doing this. Very
So
clever.
you don't have to do that because you would.
Oh, no,
What's
I
happening
would,
if you do
I'm
that?
just gonna comment.
So Lacan, so you have to imagine that Lacan, you don't have to imagine, you have to take for granted that Lacan in the 50s, in the early 50s, becomes a training analyst in Paris and is the leading or one of the leading psychoanalysts in France. And at that moment in the 50s, the international psychoanalytic movement is very much dominated by the Anglo-Saxon read English, and particularly American psychoanalysts. This has everything to do with the fact that the whole psychoanalytic movement immigrated before the Second World War to England and America. So this was the place where psychoanalysis actually happened at that moment in time. Now these psychoanalysts in America were predominantly what we know ego psychologists, or very much influenced by developmental psychology, meaning that, and this is what Lacan will identify as the betrayal of Freud, meaning that they were very much preoccupied with the idea that psychoanalysis should be about strengthening the ego, becoming a strong, let's say, integrated subject. Lacan was speaking of the dream of harmony, of harmonization. Strong ego that is able to adapt to the societal norms and values. So there's this very strong moral component to ego psychology. It has everything to do with becoming a strong ego and adaptation to societal norms and values. At the same time, there is this strong developmental psychological perspective which brings in its own normativity, because every developmental approach always implicitly has a normative position in terms of you can describe the life of the development of an individual in terms of stages that move towards a certain end result. So also here, in this train of thought, you have a very strong normative component. This whole idea, so both, I mean, it's a complex field, but both in ego psychology and in all these developmental approaches, you see that psychoanalysts, that the psychoanalytic practice has everything to do with working towards a certain norm or ideal. It introduces a norm or ideal, and one should work in the direction of that.
One should say this is not in Freud.
This is not in Freud. This is not in Freud at all, and this is what Lacan calls the betrayal of Freud.
Exactly.
This introduction of normativity in psychoanalytic practice. And Lacan, and not only Lacan, but Lacan as leader of the French Psychoanalytic Association, the French in general object to this kind of practice that is, and that is an important, let's say, political issue. In the 50s, the International Psychoanalytic Association tries to develop a whole set of regulations and procedures for the training of analysts in terms of themselves becoming strong egos, in order for the analyst to identify with the analyst. Yeah? So the analyst himself is, so to speak, embodying the norm. And the French opposed to this, let's say, this implementation, regulation, and procedure in the whole International Psychoanalytic Association. So what happens? Well, there is a kind of tribunal, which is always an interesting thing, preceded by Donald Winnicott, who's a famous object relation theorist, and they say, well, okay, the French can more or less go their own way, but we do not accept Lacan anymore as a training tool. And at that moment, Lacan decides, okay, that's it. I establish my own school. And he establishes the École Freudienne in Paris in the late 50s. And if you read the text on the ethics of psychoanalysis, you see constantly, from the very start to the very finish, that he is actually in dialogue with the opponents of the idea. There's always ego psychology and developmental perspectives in the background. These are my opponents.
Already from the
That's what-
second seminar, yeah?
Yeah, so it starts
The
very,
ego
very
psych-
early,
Yeah.
but here it becomes very explicit.
Oui.
And so that's where Lacan starts his own famous movement. He had already said we need a return to Freud, a retour of Freud, against, let's say, the betrayal by ego psychologists. And the next step is forced by circumstances, more or less, to establish his own school, and he will continue that school until his death. And at the moment that he dies, the school also stops. The École Freudienne stops in 1981 when Lacan dies. But by that time, there are already a lot of Lacanians.
Well, he dissolved first. He dissolved his own school first.
Yeah.
The Freudian, the Freudian, what do you call it?
École Freudienne.
Yes. And then he re-establishes another
Yeah.
different one called the Lacan's.
Yeah.
And that lives through.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
is true. That's true.
Now, who's responsible for this ego psychology betraying Freud specifically, and maybe what philosophers were behind that, and
Philosophers.
How
No,
and
not
why did it-
philosophers. It's
how and why did it happen?
And that kind of
It was-
Lowenstein and the people that emigrated.
Hartmann.
Hartmann, Lowenstein,
But also very much drawing upon the work of Freud's own daughter,
yes.
Anna Freud, and let's say a certain reading of the late Freud. And the late Freud, that is the Freud from the 20s and 30s, that he does have a very strong, let's say, normative tendency in that time, pushing the Oedipus complex forward, but also the famous dictum, wo es war, soll ich werden, is, let's say, a kind of motto for ego psychology. Okay, so
In English, that means.
where the id was, the ego shall be, or the ego must be. And that is one of the dictums that ego psychology connected with, saying, okay, so Freud is actually, in his late work, promoting the idea that the ego should be strengthened.
That's
one reading
that's
of that
one
dictum,
reading,
because you
yes.
can read it in very different
Oh,
ways.
yes.
And Lacan will
For
have
us, that's sort of an almost blind reading.
Yeah, yeah.
We'll go through.
no, Lacan will have a different reading.
Oh, yes, very much.
So ego psychology is also a branch of Freudian psychoanalysis. We should remember, have that in mind. And I referred to Donald Winnicott being an object relation psychoanalyst. In a sense, you could say Lacan is also an object relation.
He takes a lot of
psychoanalyst.
things from Winnicott, that's for sure.
Yeah, and he constantly talks about
Oh,
objects
yes.
and object relations. So things are more complex than they appear. And a lot of the conflicts have to do with how do you read Freud. That's one of the main problems. Just to continue the historical line, so Lacan has established his own school, and then in the mid-60s there's an interesting stuff going on in France, because Lacan hadn't published anything up to then. He had held his seminars, but they were not published. They were simply, all the seminars of Lacan are based on the notes of the students. He hadn't published anything. But one of the people in his class, in his seminars for a few years, was Paul Ricoeur. And Paul Ricoeur was the first to write a book on Freud in France called L'Interprétation. It's called, in English, it's called Freud and Philosophy. And that was in 1965. And at that moment, Lacan and his students realized we have to act. Lacan is not mentioned in the book of Ricoeur, only in one footnote or two footnotes. So Lacan and his students are not only upset, they are infuriated. And they immediately decide to publish everything that Lacan has written on paper. And that is the famous écrits, the essays, which appear in 1966, because Lacan and his students feel they have to act against the good in order to, to have the true Freudians or Lacanians speak in front of the because we don't. So the good is pushed aside, and we have the first publication of Lacan, the essays, and next to that we only have the seminars, which are published. I don't know when the publication of the seminars actually started, but I think in the 70s, very late, and very fragmented in that sense. They were not immediately all published, but they came,
They're still
like,
coming.
they're still coming. They're still coming, and they are coming in different versions, which is interesting for a
Being
theologian.
translated sequentially.
Sequentially in English and German and all kinds of languages, which is interesting for a theologian because it means that Lacan's study has become a kind of exegesis. It's a kind of biblical scholarship. You need here, you have different versions, you have different editions, and you need. It's always interesting when I go to conferences. I don't know what your experience is, but when I go to conferences, it's only Lacanians that refer to that quote Lacan by head, which is somehow connecting to the idea that there is a certain Lacan exegesis, biblical scholarship.
Even better when you pour it on a book and you put it published. Unpublished.
Unpublished. Yeah. So the seminars are still coming, and this is one that was published relatively early. But we don't have everything. And when we read the seminars, we should always remember that they are based on the notes of students. So you have different versions and the whole, and all the complications that belong to that. It also means, if you read these seminars, we discussed it already yesterday, when I said there is the difference between reading Freud and Lacan is that reading Freud is fun, reading Lacan is work. And I mean with that Lacan is very, because it's a seminar, it's very redundant, it's repetitive, it's often very much saying the same thing again and again and again from a slightly different angle with a different twist. Yeah, work, yeah, and complicated to read. Not the least because Lacan, let's say, has a tendency to develop his own language and neologisms, plays of words, which is of course part of, let's say, psychoanalysis in itself, but he does it consciously and not unconsciously, which makes his language extremely good. So I told you something about, let's say, the development in Lacan's work. I said something about the political background and his opponents. Now I have to say something about philosophy, which would be the third level here. I already mentioned this innovation of Spinoza, which returns in this text on the ethics. Spinoza wrote an ethics, Lacan writes an ethics, does a seminar on ethics. Desire is the essence of man. Comes back, I think, most clearly in the later chapters of this seminar, where he talks about living in conformity to desire. But more importantly, more important than Spinoza is the fact that Lacan is heavily influenced by philosophy of language, Ferdinand de Saussure, and structuralism, Lévi-Strauss. That's in the 50s. But these are, I think, the main, let's say, first main philosophical, anthropological, the anthropology of Levi-Strauss is actually a philosophy. It's structuralism. Structuralism in terms of the description of culture, Levi-Strauss, but also structuralism in language, Feyenoorders. So you see, especially in the 50s, very strongly the influence of structuralism on Lacan, and the function of the father introducing the child in the realm of culture and language has everything to do with that. So this thought, this thinking in terms of structures. What more can I say about that? There is in this text a lot of reference to a lot of philosophy. There's Aristotle. There's a whole, let's say, let me say it more broadly. It starts with Aristotle. There's a whole history of ethics in the ethics of psychoanalysis. Aristotle is referred to. Kant is a major point of reference. Heidegger is in the text, not explicitly, but implicitly when he talks about das Ding. He also refers to Heidegger. And also Kant. Yeah. There is probably a bit of Hegel in it. There certainly is. But there is also a religious tradition in it, which he almost treats equally with the philosophical tradition. Paul, Augustine, Luther, these are important figures in his conceptualization of, say, the dialectics of law. Because when it comes to what is the central issue in this text, it is that issue, what I now call the dialectics of law, the relation between law and desire.
Was Lacan raised in a church?
He was raised Catholic, yeah. But I wouldn't situate him in that context as far as his thinking is concerned. Certainly not in this text, because when it comes to ethics, it's interesting because I was reading this morning. We were discussing it. I was reading Kierkegaard this morning, just for fun. The concept of anxiety, which starts with Kierkegaard making a distinction between two forms of ethics. The one, he says, Kierkegaard is this, starts and relates to Aristotle. Aristotle talking about our natural, let's say, propensity towards the sovereign good. And the fact that our, what Lacan calls our ethos, can be harmonized with the ethos, the big ethos, namely the good life. We can be happy if we, let's say, develop into our virtues into habits and lead a moderate, temperate life.
And leave bestialities aside.
Well, for Aristotle, there is no bestiality, because there is, in a sense, for Aristotle, not really evil. This is what Kierkegaard says. There is no sin in Aristotle. In Aristotle, things can go wrong, but that is a question of mistake or misunderstanding or bad luck or error. But not because there is something in human nature that is tendaciously evil or inclined not towards the good. That is the first form of ethics that Kierkegaard identifies, and I would say this is very similar to what Lacan describes as a certain form of ethics that starts with Aristotle.
Yeah.
And that is all about talking about moral prescriptions and regulations, about the development of virtues and moral habits in order to be happy and to have and to be oriented towards the sovereign good and actually have access to the sovereign good. And Lacan associates that with a whole tradition that runs from Aristotle via Thomas Aquinas. That's my answer to you, sir. that Lacan distances himself here from, let's say, the Catholic moral tradition, when he says Thomas Aquinas belongs to the tradition of Aristotle, and he takes it all the way from Aristotle via Thomas Aquinas into, I would say, utilitarianism. And the whole idea that you can, let's say, organize human happiness in terms of the utilization and utility of goods.
Sounds very American.
And did he believe in God?
No. As a proper Freudian, no, I don't think so. But God does play a very interesting and complex role in Lacan's thought and in Lacan's and in this seminar in particular.
It's interesting. He doesn't believe in God, but the position of the analyst is one of a believer. So
Yeah,
we should
yeah.
leave that like
Like a question mark.
a question.
Of course, one of the famous lines from Lacan that's quoted over and over again, which is the title of Ted's book, God is Unconscious.
Yeah.
Of course, that's not as obvious as what it sounds like. Sometimes it's like, oh yeah, we know what God is. So that maybe let Tad weigh in at some point, or even do that tomorrow. But what? No, you want to.
Yeah, I wanted to return to Kierkegaard, because Kierkegaard says there's a second form of ethics, the second tradition, which has to do with the conceptualization of sin. Now, in Aristotle, there is no sin. The sin would be the inclination, propensity towards what's not the good.
Right. What we call the bestiality is the realm of sexual desires.
Yeah. And what, in this case, Kierkegaard calls sin. And for conceptualizing sin and taking sin into account, you need a different form of ethics, not your Aristotelian one, also not a utilitarian one, but something that can take account of this, let's say, propensity towards evil. And I think this is where the reference to Paul, to Augustine, to Luther, and also to Kant become important in the text. Because, and let's say, Lacan's conceptualization of law, namely not law as the whole organization of regulations and procedures that let's say, bring us in the direction of the sovereign good, and that, let's say, accommodate, but the law in a very different function, hence a different law, namely the law in relation to sin. There's a very interesting passage in Paul, and later also in Luther, where he makes this very explicit. We can read those passages, especially the Paul passage, in the next hour, third hour, where he says, well, the law, what is the law? What does the law? The law is basically a prohibition of something that is excluded. So something is excluded. You should not have access to that. And at the same time, the law makes that what is excluded or prohibited extremely important. It gives weight to that what is excluded. And here he refers to Paul and to Luther, and I think the reference to Luther is maybe the most interesting one, because Luther is very explicit in his interpretation of Paul's letters to the Romans, saying, what is the function of the law? The only function of the law, Luther said, the only function of the law is to increase sin. Yes. Because it is only through the law that we know sin. That is, so the whole function of the law is not to learn us, to show us what the procedures and the outline of how to behave. No, the only function of the law is to increase sin, because it is only through the law that we know sin. It is only through the prohibition that we know what is forbidden. Not exactly in terms of we know exactly what is forbidden, but we know that something is forbidden. Yeah? Something. The law is based on that what is forbidden, and at the same time the law produces that what is forbidden. And that should the basic, let's say, dialectics of law and desire.
So you can't, so desire and law are part of this dialectical process that brings to the fore the problem of subjectivity.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And that is exactly what I was reading this morning in Kierkegaard, and I think Lacan is basically arguing the same thing. That is what we have to look at if we want to understand what he calls the human condition. If we want to understand, let's say, the human condition in relation to ethics, ethos, a way of, not a way of living in terms of behavior, but in terms of, let's say, the whole moral agency that belongs to human nature. If we want to understand that, we do not have to look at Aristotle or Bentham. They don't teach us anything about human condition. They teach us something about how social life and social fabric can be organized in such a way that we all are more or less happy, or at least not very unhappy. But if we want to understand the human condition, we have to look at this dialectics of law and desire. And this is exactly the relevance of the reference to Paul and Luther to say, there you find the conceptualization of the law that is, let's say, precisely what I want to point at. Law reveals the sin it tried to exclude in the first place. So that's the circle. That's the
Paradox in and of itself.
and that's the paradox in itself. That's why Kierkegaard is so interesting to read with Lacan. So to speak.
Yeah, I'm very interested in this. It's actually quite opportune. We're starting a philosophy cartel, philosophy and psychoanalysis, reading the concept of anxiety. So
Yeah.
we're
Well, you could read it with this.
Yes, oh yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Real quickly, I don't want to take more than an hour for this particular segment of the discussion, but since we read The Sickness and the Death last week, can you relate any of what's going on here to that particular dialectic of law and desire? Does that relate to the kind of dialectic that Kierkegaard talks about in The Sickness and the Death?
Well, I think you were right in mentioning the word paradox, because what is this dialectics of law and desire? It is actually something that keeps itself in motion, but it cannot be resolved. There is no end solution to this dialectics. If you bring in the law, you also bring in the desire for something that is beyond the law.
And that's the self relating itself to itself.
Well, that's
So what is the self relate itself to itself? I mean, he doesn't talk about desire, but couldn't you sort of deduce that?
I think that
no,
it
but
would-
in Kierkegaard, you also don't have a solution for the despair, because in Kierkegaard we are nothing but the relation of ourselves to ourselves, and this is a tension that cannot be resolved.
Can you
And
read?
I think in Lacan you find something similar. There is a dynamics there that cannot really be.
there's nothing that closes,
That
that's
closes.
for sure, but yet there is a differentiation that perhaps will help add complexity, clarity, obscurity to the discussion. We shall see what of this. And there's a distinction of the object of desire and the object cause of desire.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
This is very something that brings to bear the paradox aside. So we can perhaps maybe, I don't know if you guys need to make a break now or just
Well,
take-
yeah, as soon as, I think we'll take a break at the finish point.
Well, then maybe I can just, when we come back,
Okay.
I can start with a few remarks that I wanted to make on
Yeah,
your
that's
presentation and maybe just
All right.
wrap it up from there.
Okay. Good, all right. 5, just 5, okay?
5 minutes. You don't give them more than 5 minutes for 3 hours. You don't give them more than 5 minutes for 3 hours. Oh, every hour. You know, I'm hurrying up for the text right now. Yes. Yeah. I think I'm going to comment on the others, which is on and take it from there to talking. I really introduce a few differences.
Hi, teacher. Welcome to the park. Are you
More bits or we shall see what?
Okay, nice, okay.
Yeah, it's very.
That's very cool. Yeah, no, I've always been really interested. It's actually gonna be quite high degree. Yeah.
It's
So
I
yeah,
work on
you just-
Levinas, is one of my main
in a
things.
way
Cool,
that.
but it's very, I
Yes,
don't know,
there's.
it'll be interesting.
And I work also on
He was what?
change and medieval.
Yeah, he was. Yeah.
I will make a comment now. Perhaps we can.
Yeah, I'm doing an analysis right now, and like I've been doing it for like a couple years, and like I said, like with the money, it's very complicated because it's hard to figure out how many people get the money to pay for it, so doing it like consistently. And it's very intimately related to how in the United States we process like mental health care. So I don't know, it's an interesting issue, and I don't know, I would have to talk about it a little bit because like I don't know how they do it in Argentina. It's something where the government can pay for it.
We have better dates, but I want to say.
Yeah, public psychoanalysis. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, that's private.
Okay. So
We are.
okay. So they just the government like assigns you patients basically.
It's very
So I
interesting.
sit in up
You
this
can
class,
do it
working
in,
color class, I teach right before, there's usually course classes in my classroom, like second hour. So I usually sit in
Oh.
Very
And who's Carl?
Carl is
Is that
stuff
we
here.
are-
Okay, and that's an ongoing class.
Yeah.
In Lacan?
No, it's a class on
Somebody
subject.
takes
So
you
there's,
can listen.
that duty, Lacan, Kierkegaard, and a few other figures that
For the procedure and.
Is
Because
that
it's
in
since-
Lacan's department?
he's in the religious studies department.
So how do they train you guys?
It's
Like did you go to college and like study psychoanalysis in
Philosophy and
college?
religious studies.
Yeah,
Well,
you have to.
you could get a master's.
You can be.
I was way
I
off,
can
because I didn't know.
We are
So, yeah, my station was way off.
Getting the mix.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
I was teaching a class on him, my
yeah,
first
like here
time.
you do,
Next
like you
winter.
want to be a psychoanalyst. Cause like I'm trying to like go down that path a
Do you
little
ever,
bit.
do you ever?
So you could do, there's like,
Yeah, I'd like to
like
come to
majors,
seminars.
postgraduate, where you have to get before you can enter the institute,
I'd love to.
which is a contentious topic in and of itself, because there's evidently a big politics as to what is going to be considered a psychoanalyst
That's,
and what is not.
I'm pretty good.
Right.
I live in
Because like
Los
Gabriella was
Angeles,
saying,
so
she doesn't
I
really
would-
like the institute. Because
Oh,
I guess they're not, I don't know. I'll just
where
talk
the,
about it.
where the red rocks are. Oh,
Yeah,
yeah,
that
that's
would
way
be.
up there.
So, for
It's like
40
there's-
minutes, so
Yeah.
a little
Right.
further than your drive, not too much.
You know,
That would be on the leader.
Marcia Dobson and John.
So
Baker.
like to advertise, for instance.
Colorado
as a
College?
I do, my very close
And,
friend,
yeah.
Rick Burschak.
Yeah, I know him.
So, yeah, he's a
Yeah.
close friend of mine, so I,
They live near the red rocks too.
In the light
Garden
of.
of God.
They don't anymore. who knew that? Oh, who
They've
does?
always
Oh,
lived
What do you
John-
mean?
John, I thought you
Marcia.
meant Rick.
Oh,
No,
no.
Rick did for a short period, lived there, but no.
You need more.
Okay, I
Yeah,
know
well,
John
that's-
and Roger haven't gone to
Yeah.
some things at the
So-
college department.
And-
because,
well,
Yeah,
yeah,
because
well,
I've done,
You can.
Rick has invited me out there a couple of
Yeah.
times, so yeah, I know them very well.
Um,
Yeah, definitely different. Well, that's what the whole thing of like,
for
some people just do it, like in the United States especially, it's like a theory. It's like when people just like study it, like it's like philosophy. I think that's true in a lot of places. And like, I don't know,
So society has like weekly conferences.
it's a
or
different
just
experience.
where this
Like
is not
you
for you,
relate
you're
to
not-
it
you're
in like
not part of it.
just bodily way. You know what I'm saying?
Um,
Feel the concept.
the society has
So
monthly
Some
lectures
relaxation.
and
So did you have to, so did they make you, like, you had to undergo a specialist?
Nobody forces you to do that. In a way, it's you can do it. You can study a bit.
Where did you first?
And you start working.
I did
you
my,
can
let's see, I
usually
did my
how
master's work at Columbia University in philosophy of science.
This is where many of us
separate from
start
any other things I want to work on.
patients.
Okay.
I had interest still in that, and then I did my
Demand.
Demand, okay.
PhD at Ohio State University, which at the time had 3 people working in medieval philosophy. So generally, a lot of philosophy departments
The
have
private office.
someone who works on
it takes
ancient and then modern.
long.
There's nothing covered in medieval. So at that time, they had 3 medievalists. So
private
since I
practice.
wrote on medieval
I was
Neoplatonism,
encouraged.
that was the place for me.
And that is
And,
one to
yeah, and then I did some postdoc work at the
always have a side.
divinity school in
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things that you have
So
to
I
do
have
like
like
that.
strong interests in theology. I'm in the philosophy department, but a lot of my classes are also cross-listed with religious studies. So I have strong
Yes, so it's,
Pay your
theology
bills.
background interests.
yeah.
And what you say.
And so are you also a practicing analyst? Or most of the people in the society? That would be
Yeah, I
pretty
would
much.
It's like being an artist,
Be yeah.
but it's got
Hey.
more value than
How you doing,
that,
Gabby?
to a certain extent. I mean, you can
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Hey, Sarah.
Hello, good
Like
to
if
see
you just
you.
self
Yeah, good to
identify
see you
Oh,
guys.
sorry.
Hey.
and nobody buys
me,
you.
I know, too long. I don't
Yes.
know why.
Very nice to see you.
If you're like a psychoanalyst, and you
Yeah.
have like,
It's been a
you
minute.
know, other skills. So
It's been a long
We
minute.
have something to say.
Yes, there's a market demand
yeah,
for it.
We'll see.
Right.
Sorry, I'm blocking. Haven't had Cracker Jacks in the past.
So what have you been up to?
Yeah, these are from my kid's stash.
Well,
Are your kids like from that era? Why is it named?
Well, I don't even know.
You understand what I'm asking?
Well, I know,
It's like
yeah,
that
it does
1920s
too, I'm
box.
sure it's
Cracker
right.
Jack, that's what I'm Then he's
I
doing
remember
that.
the good old days.
Yeah.
I created
Yeah, I don't have
foundation
lawyers.
in Colorado.
Yeah.
No worries.
Program information for Lacan analysis.
Could go ahead and do that.
We
Yeah, we do a reading group. I'd be interested at Union Cafe.
We
We're doing it this Sunday.
faculty of the College of
At 3:00.
It's a
Just
publication
on,
of
have you heard of Jacobin magazine?
and the college.
Marxist one? It
What else
is
have I
a
been
Marxist
doing?
one, yeah.
Drumming.
There's about 14 billion Marxist newspapers.
But I'm not with my practice and I think at the point where I declare myself, I don't know.
Yeah. You don't have to do that. I mean,
So
good.
busy with analytic cases.
Oh, yeah. Well,
I've never made
it to the Marx.
Yeah.
Sorry for not being.
It's going well.
I'm
This is
pro.
David Nichol.
David Nichols? Yeah. So are you with?
He's a colleague, he's an analyst from the society, so from the opponents. We shall see how.
I've had many meetings like that.
The opponents, he's part of the opponents. We're not on the other
Yeah.
Like little Bibles.
You're I love
it all.
I love it all.
Because we were
Philosophy,
like,
religion,
There you go.
There was a big fight in. There was a group in Utah that was part of called Revolutionary Student Union. And
So-
before they meeting, they would sing the
The IBA.
Internationale. It's very, very creepy.
We'll speak about that, so
Church.
anytime you refer to our institution, that you
And
ever
it's a song like from the 1800s, so it sounds like
We'll
a
tell you.
superhero song.
Yeah.
It does not sound
It's a
like,
term that is.
you know, it's not epic
Heavily
Spartacus stuff,
chalked.
it's like.
And what is your name?
Speaking of coffee shop radicals, stuff you in the idea. Do you know how many Instagrams
Sarah
I have on my
Pessin
friends,
is,
like hard latte and the
Say that again?
like the hard
Radicals
soap
here.
latte
Yes.
and the Bible verse.
Meet neighbors here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, actually, I also direct the Center for Judaic Studies. I also direct the Center for Judaic Studies, so that's
Oh,
another
okay.
area of my interest.
I'm just.
Do you know Adam Rodner?
Oh, yes.
All right, can we
We round them up.
That's why I'm okay, anxiety. Exactly, I was surprised you said that.
Yeah. Significantly, so.
Yeah, great.
What? Not virtual, exactly.
Very, very possible. We established the
Okay, can we all be seated and get started here again?
¿Me pasas un mate, tipo? Yo me paso. Las cosas.
All right, so as I promised at the beginning, we'll be looking at things, clinically, concretely. We'll be looking at text, but we'll also be looking at discourse. And of course, Lacan is all about discourse. And so Gabriella is going to kind of take off now from where we were before. In terms of the seminar itself, the outline of the seminar, kind of some points, insights, lesions, paradoxes, perhaps, whatever venture she's about to drag us into. So we'll take the next.
Somebody's left out. 45 minutes.
Yeah. So why don't you just kind of leave it ajar for right now?
They're all in, but no, there's one missing.
And then about 50 minutes, then we'll take another break and we'll just see where it goes. Okay.
Okay. So the first thing I want to say is that I'm not an academic. So in comparison with Professor Herman here, I'm going to be at the speed of a snail. I don't know if that's good or bad with you all, but if it is something that is not of your appeal, apologize ahead of time. So I am puzzled at the speed at which you guys read Lacan. This to me.
So are we.
I can imagine. When I know I asked Carl for today, I'm like, okay, so what are they supposed to read for this? Like the first 6 classes. I'm like, what? The first 6 classes of the seminar. So we read very, very, very slow. Probably because the mode of reading, the way in which we approach a seminar, an écrit, Freudian article, is generally with the intent of deriving its consequences. So we have an operation of reading when we approach the text that basically involves an attitude of reading in such a manner that you make the text give its own reasons, account for itself. This, to me, is not possible at the speed of a lightning, which is what I have just attested, which is brilliant, like a lightning, but definitely impossible for me. So when you were just talking about the sort of the genealogy of the subject, you were talking about the imaginary, symbolic, the real, and you very well stressed, these are just functions. So this doesn't mean that if somebody doesn't have a father, we're going to be outside of the realm of the law. It means basically that there are 2 operations for the emergence of the subject. One is alienation, which is what you outlined as that first initial stage in which the child is in the place of the object of desire for that matter. This alienation is already symbolic. In what way? The child needs to emerge as a subject by way of traversing into language, alienating to the signifiers of the other, if you may. If I start talking Chinese, please stop me. I don't have a problem with you interrupting me. This is just a conversation. Yeah, so please stop me. Basically, since we cannot think of any human that would be born in a world where language doesn't exist, Lacan says, and we echo, that language pre-exists the entrance of the subject in it, world. So much so that there is already sort of a Heideggerian thrownness in this, that allows for us to sort of picture what is this alienation like. So in this way, let's say, I was also very intrigued by the name of the seminar, which is Theory of the Subject, yeah?
Yeah.
And you guys reading ethics to speak of the Lacanian subject or the psychoanalytic subject, Robert. Because there is a paper of the Agree that we psychoanalysts read when we speak about this topic, which is dialectic of the subversion of the subject and dialectic of desire. So in this text, what appears most prominently, and I'm going to put this very shortly, there is a lot more involved to it, and this is no excuse not to read it. But let's think in these terms, and just bear with me for a second. It'll get worse before we get better. The idea is that, I don't know, 9 pounds of meat are given to a woman that just gave birth. These 9 pounds of meat are not yet a subject. Yes? This is a living being that we can consider. In order to turn this into a subject, language must pierce that matter. And this is the work of libidinization in Freudian terms, the work of wrapping up with language that makes us a subject. A subject is always, for us, of the unconscious, and with Lacan we say the unconscious is fractured like language, so we're always within this realm. Now, at that point, since again, we cannot conceive of any human being born where there is no language, we have to suppose that there are needs, biological needs that this baby has. Yeah? So the baby yells, and the mother says, it needs X, Y, Z. So the mother is reading through language a need that is then subverted into a demand. It wants something from me. Yeah? Side note, every demand is a demand of love. Let's leave that aside. Even judicial ones. Then, we are already off the realm of biological need. In Freud, this is also the case, yeah? We don't have any more instincts. Freud speaks of drives. Strachey had a different idea, but Freud speaks of drives, yeah? Trieb is the concept. So when we say there are no more biological needs, or with the reading of Freud's text, Civilization and its Discontents, for example, or which is actually quoted in the very beginning of this seminar as an entry to ethics, there is something that happens with becoming civilized that implies a cut, a different order that is no longer natural, since we speak. Okay. Now, the demand is then in this alienating moment, initial moment, is something then that the subject alienates to the signifiers of the other, demands of the other. At this point, what the third concept of this text that I am speaking about, of the Agree, is desire, to which Lacan dedicated the year prior to the seminar in question tonight. So, desire, Lacan says, is to be found where, in the margin where demand rips away from the need. So, it is to be found in the interval, in the gap, in between. In between what? In between signifiers. So, in the alienating moment, Lacan speaks of a choice. It's kind of curious that at this point in time he would speak of a choice. It sounds almost as if he was speaking of, one could confuse it as a free will, an act of free will. It's nothing like it. It's more like something that he speaks of in terms of a forced choice. So, faced with a choice that it is between one or other, he'll have to choose. Every time we choose, we lose. Yeah? So, loss is inherent to the process. When we choose one signifier, that one doesn't represent us completely. That is the same to say, in the way the mother reads the need, there is something that doesn't cover it completely. The linguistic operation is never complete. There's always a remainder, there's always a rest. Yeah? So, what happens? It happens that the baby just has been fed, but yet is still crying, or is still sucking at the pacifier. So this is where we see that biology stops working as such really, really quickly. Basically, the demand, the subversion of the need into a demand by way of language carried out by the other is not complete. It leaves this remainder. This remainder will become the place, the setting, in as much as it is something not completed, a gap, will become the seat, we could say, tentatively, the seat of desire. Now, when Herman, you were saying the function of the father, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And you were talking about liberation and limitation.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm assuming that's what we will talk about tomorrow night, some of this.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's interesting. You were saying the father, at some point, after all of this, comes in and says no to something. Not snow, sorry, that's my desire. It's not. It's just no. It's happening next week. So says no to something. Recently, in a seminar in France, where we were talking about a later teaching of Lacan, but basically the tangent goes like this. We were speaking of the initial name of the father concept, and then the plural of this, the names of the father later on. So we were speaking of the function of the father as something that it's a dire que non, a saying that no. It's kind of untranslatable in English. But basically what it means is that the father will be somewhat careful enough to mask the choices of his own enjoyment to the child, the choices of his own results. Basically, the normative piece that I think you were talking about is that in Freud we read this in the Oedipus and the castration complex. Yeah, this is normative in two senses, and Lacan goes along with this to a certain degree and speaks of the function of the father as one that introduces the child to the law that is linked to desire. So I guess the idea is that the father, at least in the realm of neurosis, assumes the function of exception, relieving the subject from taking such a place. In psychosis, when this fails, what we see is a push to an exception. Yeah? A push to a place of exception. That we will talk a little bit tomorrow morning, by way of a case, so I hope we can all relate to this. The other thing that is that I was very puzzled with is that you know, at the beginning it was very difficult for me at the beginning when I started studying Lacan. When I started struggling with Lacan, is actually better. And back then, it was very hard for me to conceptualize a mother like a machine of language almost, like a linguistic machine that is pushing this kid, this little person into language in such a way. So it had nothing to do with the sweet Freudian mother, you know, tender and all of these things. It's almost Clockwork Orange when we turn into this concept. So to me, at the beginning at least, to speak of these terms and distinguish the functions is it's a necessary distinction to be made. What happens with the ego psychologists and the self-psychologists and all of this is, you know, this political part that Herman was just talking about is something that we can read with the three logical moments of Lacan. We can speak of Freud as the instant of seeing, yeah, like a traumatic event where he's faced with hysterics and he is absolutely convinced that they know about their suffering better than anyone else, and that they're not really pretenders. Freud is charged with a study that I think Charcot or Janet endeavors to him about a comparison study between hysterical paralysis and organic paralysis. And what he finds here is that the body that these ladies were speaking of was a body made of signifiers, made of language. It was not the organic body. It didn't behave like an organic paralysis. It behaved more like we conceive the body in speech. This we can conceive as a first instant of seeing where Freud is faced with this and develops the entire theory and method of psychoanalysis as a way to treat primarily neurosis. Although he speaks of psychosis and he speaks of another thing called actual neurosis, we can talk later on about this through the course of the conference. Then, the next thing that comes after seeing is latency, period of latency, yeah? Latency is the post-Freudians. We could see the post-Freudians as latency, yeah? As a moment in which the trauma has to be forgotten somehow, especially by his own daughter, who, you know, you gotta excuse her, she's not quite a father, so who knows what that would have been like. She goes on and explains an entire book of mechanisms of defense based on ego experience. Yet, all that happens with post-Freudians in general, not so much Winnicott and Melanie Klein, but pretty much every other one, is decontextualizing a piece of Freud, like, for example, the stress on the ego being an organizing agency, forgetting that its roots are in the id, same as the superego, and that it is a slave that has three masters, not one. So we're quite a complex agency to go put so much weight on. So Lacan is a little bit more French, you can say. Pardon me. We have a French in the paying homage here, so I got. But he says the ego is structured like a symptom. So the position of Lacan is absolutely opposite in this. And he gets to this position reading Freud. If you don't decontextualize Freud, the ego is just one more agency. In fact, the most troubled one. So, and the least important, yes. So, latency. Then we have the moment to conclude, and we can find Lacan in this moment. And he is, in a way, producing this return to Freud, which concludes in a logic that is at stake in analysis, yeah, in Freudian analysis. If you are to read, I wouldn't say the entirety of the 25 volumes, but most of them, at least, not just read the technical papers, which is what happens generally. It's more the case in America. Yeah? America, traditionally, analysts are formed in that tradition, and with a lot of post-Freudian authors, and nowadays they are even encompassing neuropsychology and a lot of other things that all of a sudden becomes something so encompassing that we are no longer very clear on what we're talking about. At least that's what happens to me in those milieux. Again, I am from Argentina. In Argentina, everybody goes to the analyst. It doesn't matter the sphere of society you live in. If you haven't been to one, something's really wrong with you. And it is free in cases where people need it. You can go to the hospital and be with an analyst, and this is free. The same happens in Brazil, in South America in general. I was just in Colombia not too long ago, where this is also thriving. So I don't know if we are really a very weird realm of the world, but this is the place of the world that is producing most about psychoanalysis, researching in psychoanalysis clinically right now. In fact, our two colleagues right here, Matthias and Dominique, are doctoral researchers, as well as myself, for the University of Buenos Aires. And we will hear about their work through the course of the conference as well. So I think that we can understand the movement of psychoanalysis with those three logical moments, yeah, the instant of seeing, latency, and moment to conclude. This, by the way, is borrowing on some ideas of a mentor of mine, Professor Hector Lopez, another Argentinian nuts, who was also in this house a few years ago. Sarah, I think you were there. And he will be back this September. So we'll be perhaps organizing something else for then. The other thing that is very striking about how that you outlined very well when you said the aim of analysis for the ego psychologists is to somehow, the analysand has to identify with the analyst in the end, which means that the analyst cannot have any sort of contact with the analysand whatsoever unless in the office. Means that he has to become an ideal. How do we do this if they know the slightest bit of our life? Third of all, it speaks of a hygienic concept of the end of analysis, something of the realm of, okay, well, the subject is producing, got married or divorced, no matter what, but did some sort of change in relationship, is somewhat happy looking, and has made some moves that somewhat tend more to adaptation in the terms of society, that is, meaning you are standardizing a subject, basically. This is an achieved a good aim, yeah, for ego psychologists, self-psychologists, and so forth. In Freud, there's nothing of this nature. There is a very early text of Freud called Advice to the Physician, where he speaks very loosely about, in fact, the title conveys it, it's just an advice, yeah? It's not a requirement. It is an advice of how to do technically in the office with each analysis. And he speaks of the technique as something that needs to fit the hand as if it was a hammer. Yeah, so each and every hand grabs the hammer in a different way. So is the freedom with which Freud approaches the matter. Much later on, this becomes standard because of a real need. Ferenczi was faced with an enormous amount of people who were coming from the war, yeah, vets and so on, who needed attention. So he needed to kind of parcel time in a way that he could see everybody. There's the 50 minutes, yeah. But Freud never spoke of this. In fact, he had sessions that were longer, shorter every day, more than once a day. This was not Freud's intent. Yet, nowadays, for example, a training analyst is somebody who has undergone analysis with another training analyst for at least 4 years, 4 times a week, 50 minutes each time. And involving somewhat of a third of your salary at least. Here is the context, yeah? For us, this is very different. And this is where the ethics, in as much as concerning something that has to do with your own action as an analyst, is something that is not standard. In as much as it involves desire, it is guided by desire, it is an ethics of desire, we cannot standardize desire. This is impossible. Desire is the essence of man, as Spinoza would say, and also indestructible in Freudian words, yeah? Called it indestructible. For Lacan, this is the most singular thread we have. And if the ethics of psychoanalysis is to be approached from this perspective, there is no standardization whatsoever in practice. And this was part of the break with the IPA. Lacan spoke of a non-standard time, a non-chronological time of each session. So sometimes, instead of interpreting, he would just cut the session soon, in place of an interpretation. This was something completely unacceptable to the IPA. And this, among other issues, became unbearable. For the IPA, I guess, and so they excommunicated Lacan. Since then on, Lacan has had he has bet wholeheartedly in the analytic discourse. When Lacan speaks of discourses, he speaks of a mode of social bonding. Yeah? So, like between the slave and the master, there are certain characteristics that happen. Yeah? And thanks to Hegel, we know that the one that knows is the slave. In the university, you guys are students, these guys are professors. In the office, I'm the analyst, the one on the couch is the analysand. There is a mode of organization in each discourse. The way in which Lacan thinks how is that analysis is to be advancing. I don't like the word progress, but moving, I guess, continuing the move of desire is by way of the school. The school is not an association. It's not a society. The school is a very different thing where what prevails is desire. So we said earlier, the seat of desire was a remainder that was left in that linguistic operation of transforming a need by way of language into a demand. That which is not covered by it we said, is the seat of desire. In the school, this is put to work. This is the place of the cause. What basically propels the work going continues to cause desire. Lacan spoke of the school in many texts that are to be found, some in French actually. I don't know that there are many English translations of school texts of Lacan, but the proposition of the analyst and a few more are to be found. We will give some more information on this, websites and the like, tomorrow. Or whenever we have a board. No board in the university, that's strange.
What?
No board.
Not in this room.
Okay. Well, we're going to be here tomorrow. I
Yeah,
can bring one.
we can bring one.
So the idea is to put desire to work. In a Freudian way, this would be put conflict to produce. Yeah. In the causal place. And I think, you know, when Lacan starts talking in the outline of this seminar, he starts talking about the ethics, and he makes a differentiation with morality that we analysts don't know very clearly, but he says, okay, well, I'm not going to choose to speak about morality. I'm going to choose a more unique word, this one, ethics over here. And as Herman was saying, speaks about Aristotle all the way to Bentham, yeah, by way of Roman Jakobson, nonetheless, another linguist that was actually there that day. So Roman Jakobson, I guess, tells Lacan about the work of Bentham as a very interesting work that perhaps we could go further in. I don't know what your specialties at all are, but perhaps we can start talking about this. The outline, the idea of this first initial meeting of the seminar is talking about all these other ways of speaking of ethics, which is psychoanalysis, yeah. He's linking it all the time to the previous seminar, desire. Yeah? And this is where the seminar will end. Spoiler alert. And then, by lieu of coming to presentation of what will be not orderly at all, and what is his style, he speaks of an ending that comes close to considering the economy of masochism. So, you said you're a Freudian scholar. Yes. So perhaps I would like to now, maybe, I don't know, we've spoken to these kiddos enough, and I would like to hear what you think so far. How was it to read 6 classes stretch for you? This to me sounds traumatic. Given it is a very good translation, and you're not reading a bootleg copy, which could be a lot worse. But anyway, we can. I think that what Professor Rashka was saying earlier about cartel. A cartel is something that has to do with the school of Lacan. Yeah, there are 2 things that I will say this, and then we can just move on. 2 things that are the propelling organs of the analytic discourse. One is the cartel, which is a base organ, that's how he calls it, of the school. It's a group, a small group based on the Bion model of working groups, where 4 or 5 people meet on an agreed topic to read, to talk, to think about this topic. But it's not meant to be a group, although it is. It's not meant to be. It's meant to avoid imaginary effects, yeah? So, in that sense, the cartel brings everyone together, but everyone has their own agenda, in a way, yeah? They have their own individual question that is furthered in development by way of doing it together, yeah, in a way that you could not have gone that far alone. Yet each and every one's is their own question. Yeah? The only thing common is the topic, not the questions. And there is a function of a plus un that is, or a plus one, that is somewhat of a dummy Socrates, we could say, that is instigating the process to continue. Yeah. So why? Okay, yeah, you're thinking it why. Yeah. In a way that is going against the stagnation of the process. The other organ is the past, which is the examination of a moment, of the analysis of someone who generally wants to be an analyst. An examination of a resolving moment, a final moment of the analysis that inquires about the authorization of the analyst by himself, that inquires about the desire of the analyst as the production, as the remainder of an analysis. Yeah. And I'm going to stop right now.
Okay, can I
Yes.
just jump in there right there and say, so following that whole notion of the cartel where there's a topic, but everybody has their own agenda, and
Yes.
since everybody is a set of questions,
Yes.
you know, in some ways, I would hope we would read Lacan this particular way. Now, you know, in some ways, yes, it's a lot of reading, but, you know, it's because, you know, as Freud, you know, asked, or Lacan asked the question, I can't remember now, about psychoanalysis, terminal or interminable.
Freud.
Yeah, Freud. But unfortunately, you know, in a academic setting with
You gotta finish.
accreditation and course hours and meeting times and so forth, and
Sure. expectations
of reading and so forth, you know, courses, especially in the quarter system, are not interminable.
Right, right.
Right. So I think, you know, in some ways, each one of us, it's very hard for a professor, you know, to get students to understand the purpose of a course is not somehow to absorb what an authority is telling them about somebody else, or to say that, well, how can I understand Lacan? You know, can you explain Lacan? You know, I mean, no offense, but you know, you did a good job of kind of reviewing the history of Lacan, but you didn't explain Lacan. No, you didn't try to. No. And if you were expecting him to explain Lacan, you know, you'd be disappointed, and that's good. Okay, you can't read Lacan thematically. There are things that keep coming up. There are, you know, threads. You know, I just talk about it. That the notion that there's somehow a, you know, a concept here that has to be mastered. You know, that's a whole different kind of paradigm, you know,
Yeah.
and it's very difficult because in the academic world we expect, you know, that somehow it's our purpose to communicate something that sort of fits together, and if you don't see how it fits together, then you're somehow deficient and so forth, when in fact what makes it fit together is the discourse itself, you know, the chain of signifiers we use Lacanian. So I would hope in these discussions, you know, and continuing tomorrow, and you know, we're using different formats. We'll be talking about a transgender case over breakfast in the morning, and then we'll be talking about books, and then you'll be, you know, lecturing and, you know, and so forth. But in some ways, each one of us is coming with these kind of agendas, and if this is about the theory of the subject, that it's these particular struggles and these agendas and the pointing of desire that takes place in each one of us as we're all sitting around the table. Sometimes it's articulated, you know, sometimes it's not. You know, that's really the you know, that's what we should be getting out of Lacan and so forth.
Yeah, we should know that desire is just not purely not articulable.
Right, yeah.
Articulating, not
So
articulable.
let me instead of me talking here, let me ask the students. You know, now we're gonna ban passivity. What do you desire?
Or have you acted in conformity?
With your desires, right? Well, you know, I mean, in some ways, that's philosophy is the, you know, the love of wisdom, right? I mean, it's a desire for something that's not really attainable in any sense. I mean, the whole notion of wisdom as opposed to the good.
So you're just a bunch of masochists, you're saying.
Yeah, right. Somebody who's taking on,
We're on
anybody's
top.
taking on
We're
student
very much
debt,
on
you know,
top.
to be involved in this kind of organization.
We Argentinians don't have that kind of problem. you know.
No. So this,
We don't pay.
so that's why they need analysts as well.
We are paid by.
Or at least to know that our quest for knowledge never comes to the truth.
Right.
Uh,
But no, I mean, let's just open it up for a little bit. We'll listen to what she's saying, kind of how the purpose of the cartel and the seminar, and what analysis really is, because I mean, there's both philosophy and analysis going on. I mean, we would be remiss to say there's no philosophy, because Lacan's always dropping philosophical names, and he's making very profound and interesting philosophical points. Before the evening's over, I'd like to. We could have a discussion in an appropriate Lacanian way about what's going on when he's talking about the thing. He's talking about the mother. He says that. He's talking about the mother, but he's also talking about the Kantian thing in itself. But you can't approach that, in the way a philosopher would approach it. You can't approach it in terms of German idealism. You certainly can't approach it in terms of Hegel or Kierkegaard and so forth. So I mean, there's, in some ways, it does all start from desire. So, anybody want to go forward on this? Do we want to join this cartelized conversation?
Just have the conversation.
Yeah.
Maybe couching the notion of desire for just a second, though I'm sure that they'll be integrated in some way. I'm interested if you could speak to at least a little bit.
No,
language.
can't you? We'd like you to speak.
Okay.
That's okay, but go ahead.
Just as far
This
as
is a
it
way of speaking,
language
yeah?
in its standing relationship to the symbolic order. Because I have on the one hand this notion that the unconscious itself is articulable, or at least in part as a language, or rather structured as a language, and then I have this movement towards speech of the child that enters into the symbolic order, but fairly little on the type of relationship between the language itself, not just the mere apprehension, but language, the movement of that thing, to the order of the symbolic. I'm wondering if there's something more to be said.
Okay. I'm gonna note this, and we can continue the conversation, and we'll come back to this.
I would like to say something about your question. You asked them, what was their desire, and I think we could say that's a tricky question, because as desire is unconscious, we cannot say that by words. So what you can be believe by that, there's not good answer. But perhaps it's an approach to desire, something that
Well,
moves.
yeah. I mean, it was a provocation the way she was talking about. Obviously, there's no answer to the question.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most interesting things for me in Lacan, which comes across in various ways in the seminar, when he talks about, when he talks about the Freudian notion of bonum, again,
Freudian notion of?
bonum,
Okay.
or it's a Freudian notion, which can mean roadway, or can mean sort of like a track. A railroad track is a bond. A bond is movement across the track. The various variations of that. German Freud uses the term, and he said this gets translated as facilitation in the English translation, which he says it's wrong, it's very misleading, and he's probably correct there, but that sounds like what ego psychology we come up with. But in what bottom is this process, this chain of signification, this constant articulation, or this system of enunciation. So in other words, we don't arrive at the truth, we learn to speak the truth. We learn to, in a sense, come to something we can start speaking truthfully about, but in the sense of an object or a telos, of our subjective, implementation of desire. In some ways, what even the question of what we desire, is all about when we start talking. We start talking about our problems. We start talking about our anxieties. We stop talking about these seemingly, irreconcilable notions that we have in a sense and so forth. So my provocation, following this particular line was to get you to start talking. You know, I mean, I could, you know, jokingly say, okay, well, let's talk about your mother. How do you feel about your mother? But you know, it's kind of, you know, that's kind of trite. That's so
Too much.
There's no couch in the area. Go ahead, Brenda.
I was just, because I keep thinking about your question, and I was wondering if sometimes to get people to speak, and maybe I'm wrong, so please let me know, to get not an idea of what their desire is, because again, it would be difficult to do, but just to ask a very simple question sometimes helps me a lot. And I'm very curious to ask them, and you know, is why are you here? What brings you here tonight? Is it just because you've asked them to do it?
required.
Is it a requirement? Or is there something more to that? Maybe an intuitive, intrinsic motivation that may lead to something more interesting?
AKA desire.
I didn't want to say the word
I think
another
it'd
time.
I'd like to hear from some of the students in the class. Maybe the way we could frame it is obviously it's a class, and you're supposed to come to class, and I'm supposed to teach it. It's supposed to be taught at these kind of hours. So there is, you know, there is the law that's functioning here. So,
Sure.
but at the same time, there's this allure of the subject matter of the course. You know, they're not required to take the course. Though it's kind of interesting how many of you that funky therapist, the picture of on the poster for the course. I mean, you were saying that kind of drew you to take the course because it kind of drew what it is, you know, the therapist from Twin Peaks and that kind of thing. So I mean, there's obviously something operating, you know, here. And you know, Lacan has this kind of mystique. He's also creates terror in people's minds, you know, especially if you have to read him. Especially in America. And so I think, you know, the question would be not so much why are you here, but, you know, why are you drawn into this kind of conversation?
Matthew?
Yeah. What's your name? My name's Nick. Nick. All right. Well, I will pick up your question, Nick. I think it's a very important question. I would paraphrase it like, what could be the possible consequences of a symbolic approach towards language? And I think that this is pulsing in a way by Barbara's question regarding why, or your remark on the father introducing something. Father introduces something. But I think that if we have a symbolic approach towards language, and that is also touching Spinoza in a way, I think regarding immanence, the origin of language wouldn't be the father. I think that symbolic approach means that there is more to language than the verbal performance, competence after Chomsky. I think that one consequence is that we are not, and this is part of our ethics, psychoanalysis, the question for the origin is lost in that sense. Since we inhabit language, we cannot put our finger on the origin anymore. So, what do you think is the origin of language?
Well, in the schema of immanence, there would be no, the import of that question would be evaporated. Right? It's not so much the origin, it's the function, like the movement of that thing rather than its inertia.
Okay. But we are touching, it's impossible to answer that, but the function, the movement, I like that. I would also say that the origin of language is language. The that in Horizon is how we listen to talking being, or perhaps how you approach a text, or you think. And the way we do that is our ethics. I think that desire is intimate, ethics are intimate. They concern you in your most intimate part. And I think that also is about what Spinoza came to say, that the way you think is your ethics. In an ethic work he did when he was wondering what happens if we think that everything that is possible is necessary. And so far. But I think that immanence, to work within the immanence of language, is one of the consequences of a symbolic approach to language.
I think one thing might be worth talking about here is the conceptual issue. That is Lacanian unconscious. Because, I think you've raised a very, very important and crucial point, which really is what distinguishes Lacan, or at least the approach of Lacan from that of Freud and even the Freudians. And that's the kind of informativeness that this whole approach has with the self-consciousness of, the linguistic dimension. Talk about the 20th century philosophy taking the linguistic turn, but in some ways, but that's focused on what we might call the formalities of language, or what Derrida would call its grammatology. The logos of the structure of language and so forth. And Lacan's not interested in the structure of language. What he's interested in is the structure of the unconscious. In fact, he says that famous line, which you hear quoted all the time, but you have to read it in context to get at what he's really meaning. And in fact, it's right here in the text we asked you to read for tonight. The unconscious is structured like language, which doesn't mean you have the unconscious and then you have language. There's this kind of analogy between the unconscious and language. It's like language and unconscious are language, and so forth. So this notion of this unconscious as substrate, or this unconscious as a kind of causal structure that somehow is, underlies and has all these kind of occult effects on the conscious structure. But that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about process. He's talking about linguistic process. He's talking about talking. This is not Sprach in the German sense. This is Reden. This is conversation. This is not really Lang in the French sense. There's two words in French for language, Lang and parole, and distinction is the very basis of post-structuralism. Parole is, the sort of implementation of speech. It's not dialectic, it's dialogue. It's dialect, so to speak. It's the way we talk, even when we chatter on. So, and he's really, in some ways, that's what both a seminar and an analysis session is. It's parole. So we tend to avoid all this and say, okay, well, that's just about what people talk about, but let's get to the real, issues, which is what philosophy says about language, or philosophy says about the real. You can't do this. And in some ways, Lacan, it's interesting, and I made that point in a Facebook post last week in review, actually after our cartel that night, about, that you have to ask, why is it all these famous French philosophers that you all study and have this kind of mystique and cachet, every one of them was seriously impacted by Lacan, and particularly a lot of the Lacanian seminars. Why? You know, because there's something else going on here. And, you know, it's not about, you know, trying to understand what Lacan is saying. It's about, you know, trying to get at what you're saying. Why, and it's asking, you know, why you're saying it. Not the purpose for your saying. There's not a teleology here, but what's going on with you? Gabriela's your initial point. In a cartel, we all bring our agendas. So I think the question, I would really like to hear from one of the students in the class at this point. I mean, Nick has, you know, talked, but you didn't really answer the question I think that was posed here. And that is, so what is your agenda? You know, what are you, why are you here? You know, other than the obvious.
Is it what I desire or why am I here?
Well,
I think the latter.
The latter?
Yeah, let's take things possible for now.
So for myself, at least, because my interest in most of my study falls within the post-structuralist French continental tradition, and so it is imperative to, of course, I've read Lacan. My lack in reading Lacan is a sincere gap in my scholarship that I would like to fill.
So it's kind of instrumental then that you just didn't learn it for
No,
historical
I mean,
reasons?
so of course the access point is that thing, and I think your point is well taken, right? It's not so much about understanding Lacan as it is about, you know, turning to understand myself. But at first, of course, there's an instrumentality. Like I have to read him and learn him, and then he may indeed become beautiful and poetic and meaningful to me in a wider sense.
If you read Lacan in another milieu, you may not have to. You may just approach it differently.
That's not a closed system.
It's possible, it's possible. We're here at them as well. Joe.
For analyzing him, I'd like to know why you think scholarship is so important. Why would you like to engage in the scholarship? What's the value of it?
The value of the scholarship as opposed to.
To you personally, why are you engaging in the scholarship? What is the relationship of this you know, gross discourse to how you live your life?
Yeah, because my desire is for repeat and trigger, right? Because I would love to lord myself over people and say that I've read a lot of abstracted French, you know, politics. Of course.
I don't know. That's just asking a question.
Indeed, must be.
So you
Well,
want to be,
nevertheless, this doesn't need to get exactly so personally and meaty. The idea is to try to think over these concepts. We can be as personal as we want to, and I appreciate your question. I thought it was a very interesting question.
I wonder if I could hear from some of the other students here before the other people or non-students jump in.
So a similar question was posed to us in the ProSem seminar in philosophy last quarter. Why are we here? Why do we care about what we're reading? And we got asked this like each week as kind of but I never really understood how to answer the question other than I was just searching for more possibilities, more questions, more routes. I don't know where I want to go, but I'd rather have more doors open than blank walls. I'd rather have more doors than blank walls, I guess. And I think Lacan is a way of breaking down certain walls that are put up. And I, again, don't know. And I feel just like Socrates in saying that, but there's a lot of not knowing, which is kind of fun.
Yeah, in fact, that is right on point with the ethics. We'll come back to that. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I feel like compelled that I should say something because I'm the only student who's just sitting in on the class.
Yes, I'm
Not
sorry.
actually
Can you please
enrolled.
all say your names?
Yeah.
So we get a little bit more subjective.
So I'm Jared.
Nice.
And I'm Tolly.
Yeah, so I'm like the only student that's not actually enrolled in the class. I'm just addicted to Carl, I think. And so I
You should come to the addictions
So I
class.
keep taking
I hope you work through that.
So Carl let me sit in. In some ways I could say, he let me sit in on the class because it's, called Theories of the Subject. I hope to do a comprehensive exam in Theories of the Subject. It has to do with dissertation stuff I'm doing, like all that stuff. But I mean, and you kind of beat me to the punch what I was going to say, is that isn't the point precisely that we don't know, that we cannot know. I mean, you could keep asking me questions, like you could keep asking, but why?
I did
But
not
why?
mean to be
But
rude.
why?
I was just,
No,
it's
I-
important to me in a personal
Yeah.
way, so.
No, but like, I think we could keep asking, but why? But then why? And we get to this point where we're like, well, fuck, I don't know. Like, and I think that, I mean, like the 3 words I understood from Lacan, because I don't really do that much philosophy and stuff, even though I'm addicted to Carl. Or I guess he's not a philosopher, is he? He's a
That
psychoanalyst. But
counts, yeah.
is that there isn't a knowing, right? And it's in that unknowingness that maybe the subject then begins to reveal itself. I mean, as I was reading, I'm also taking another class where we're reading Judith Butler, and she takes a lot of Lacan, right? And then she uses Foucault also, right? And she has this great line where she said, it's in her text, the giving an account of oneself, which is almost, right, like, where is my subjectivity? Where is this coming from? And she kind of ends the book with saying, there's this kind of moment of, I don't know shit. And it's in that moment when we just approach our unknowingness that maybe something becomes revealed, but I have a sense that then she would say, but you don't approach that unknowingness so that you can be revealed, right? It kind of happens in spite of,
Yes.
right? And,
There's a
it,
certain decay
it's
in it.
slippery, right? We
Yes.
can't grasp it. And that's part of maybe a kind of anxiety about our own subjectivity.
I think you not only understood those 3 words alone of Lacan, you might have understood further than you think. Because the kind of subjectivity that is at stake in analysis is the one that slips.
Right.
Is the one that escapes the process constantly. Exactly. And also, this idea of not knowing is not only the process, part of the process, part of the anguishing process, but also the aim, a requirement, a structural requirement. In the act, we're concerned with ethics tonight, in the act, there is not knowing, yeah? And there is no subject in the act. So that in that sense, the one of the later formulations of the unconscious, definitions of the unconscious in Lacan, is the unconscious is a knowledge without a subject. Yeah. So that what we can conceive is that there is something that is at stake in analysis, that it is of very, very, very difficult transmission. And we are here tonight. This is why, again, I know you're in academia and you have a lot of requirements and courses and things, but if I had to read what you guys are doing, I'd be shooting my brains. So the aim of the analyst's own analysis is to go through the experience of saying in analysis. There is something of the invocative realm in the experience of analysis that doesn't happen if you just read Lacan, if you just read Freud, if you just read whatever analyst, if you don't lay on somebody's couch, if you don't speak and listen to yourself say in a way that it concerns you more than you could calculate, there is something missing, yeah? And it's only transmissible in experience. That's the knowledge that you can predicate on. There is not something you can articulate about your own desire. What do you desire?
And I think
Impossible.
Yeah, but
Go ahead.
I think what you were talking about, Jared, about the anxiety, I think it's also something that has to do with it, is to be able to, I mean, at least for me, be able to sit and experience and stay with that anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
That I think once you speak it out, first of all, you become more aware of it, and then it is something that you have to experience. That it's not really tangible in a book.
well, I'm a little bit puzzled about how we approach and think about desire here, because I was now sitting back, listening to people trying to articulate the desire and reaching a certain limit, the possibility of articulating desire. But Lacan, when Lacan talks about desire, he talks about also about a certain recalcitrance,
Something?
a certain recalcitrance,
Uh-huh.
a certain resistance against any, let's say, any imposed invitation to act, conform that what is. So when you ask, I want to hear what you desire,
Yeah.
the ones that actually probably act according to the desire are the ones that sit back and say, no, I'm not going to answer the question. Because that's desire. That's also, I would say, very Lacanian to think about desire in that terms. The kind of the resistance against, the resistance, the desire that resists a certain conformity to a collective objective, or
Yeah,
some
and
kind of,
that's where the whole dialectic of law and desire comes in. Yeah. So, I mean, so in some ways, I mean, we tend to think of law as in terms of moral prohibition, but law also has more in Lacan the sense of normativity, a kind of expected normativity. So, it's like the students. The basic question a student always asks is, "What do you expect? What do you expect?"
Sure. When I thought that the way you outlined the law earlier as liberation and limitation, and you mentioned, yes, it's when you went on to speak on Kierkegaard and say, okay, we have a sin since it is prohibited. So in a way, it's flagrantly putting a neon sign on the sin, that it wasn't there before. So that we can say that law also inaugurates the realm of temptation as well. So that with desire, yes, there is, I think if I hear you correctly, there is a defense against desire. The psyche defends against it, inhibits it, symptomatizes, anguishes.
Yeah, but also in every the desire is also the reaction against the demand that is made, or the obligation that is imposed on someone.
Sure, that has
And
nothing to
Carl-
do with desire. The obligation. How come? How would you relate the two? The obligation that is made upon the subject.
Yep. Simply like in the example that Carl acted out for us, saying, I invite you to articulate your desire. Why are you here?
Right.
I can react against it and say, no, I don't want to. That is also a moment where desire would say.
Yes.
Yeah,
and so
namely
the
in the
desire, right.
I don't want to answer.
But then you would assume that the desire would be to answer it if you're calling it resistance.
No, that's not what I mean.
Okay,
That's
so
not what I
I'm not
mean.
following you.
No. I mean it more transgressive and more subversive.
Okay.
Something that resists the compliance to what we were supposed to do. Something that undermines it.
We say of Eden, right?
Huh?
For example, there is no temptation without the prohibition of
Yes.
the tree.
Yes.
Did anybody ever see that Sopranos episode where he's required to go to the Atlas? Do you remember that one?
Yes.
No? ¿Qué pasa? I don't remember. What's going on? Please go
Well,
on.
it's been a while since I've seen it, but he basically sits there and it's very humorous in a lot of ways, but it's also very profound, which I think explains the popularity of the HBO series. Here's a guy who's lives in secrets, part of the mafia, he whacks people, and I don't remember why he had to go to the Atlas. It was court ordered, or he told his wife he would go with him. Huh?
Yeah, he keeps passing out.
Yeah, right.
He's having panic attacks or something.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And so he's just kind of sitting there. And,
actual neurosis.
Yeah.
So are you saying it to myself out loud to see if I understand? Are you saying that the resistance to a demand is revealing an alternate or subversive desire in the subject, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
That's actually,
Right.
yeah, okay, now I
Yeah,
understand.
and the Lacanian question, have you acted have you acted in conformity to your desire, is not the same thing as have you tried to, let's say, adjust your desire to the conformity.
Right.
That's different, that was my point, actually. It's two different things.
I was just gonna make an observation about this, like, this happened just now when people were being asked why they were here, but this happens a lot, like, when questions like in that register get asked of people, where someone asks me, why are you here, and I immediately start explaining how I got here, like what chain of events, or like
Yeah, I
what
remember when I
reasons.
met you, you said walking.
Right, yeah. Right, so you asked me this, and this is what made me think of it, is when I was at the forum, you asked us how we got there, not why we were there. And I thought that was really interesting because, well, I mean, maybe in a sense, like, asking how I got here is kind of like, so I'll look at this kind of chain of events, like a causality of reasons, I can kind of retroject like how I got here. But when you ask me why I'm here, it's maybe precisely like we were saying, I'm not really adding anything here, but it's on the register of desire. It's sort of something that I can't, like, you ask me why I'm here, I'm like, I don't know, like, why am I here? It's something that's like really close to me, but precisely something that's like sort of inaccessible to me, something like that. I was just going to point out the how and the why, something along those lines. But I don't know if that means that the question, why am I here, is like in the register for real or something like that, like this kind of thing where, because on the other hand, with the how, I can sort of symbolically say, obviously I can talk about it and stuff like that, but why I'm here is precisely something I can't say.
But that's a good point. That gets into one of the issues I think that comes up in this text, you know, where you said at the beginning, you know, this is where you really gets into the question of the real. And I think there's, you know, I think when I first started reading Lacan, I was like, well, you know, you got these different registers, so it's symbolic, the real. I think reading Zizek too much can confuse you on that, because Zizek
It definitely will confuse you on Lacan.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
But you know, it's like you tend to think of the real as just sort of the, you know, you read Zizek, it's like a horror movie, you know, when Jason Bates, you know, appears with the knife or something like that. That's not really what Lacan uses. This whole, in sense, it's the Wiederfinden, you know, the trying to find, to recover, and he is a beautiful, you know, definition of the real. If people could say this, the real is always being in the same place. So what does that mean in some ways? Well, we're always trying to somehow come back to a certain place. You know, that's where the whole question of the thing comes in, and so forth. And we can't do that by saying, okay, here's the real. What do we mean by the real? What register we belong to? We can only be in the same place. Maybe in a conversation we have this weird thing called consensus, but that's not even Lacanian real, because, you know, it's not agreement. I mean, it has to do with you. It has to do with your desire. It has to do with your subjectivity. It has to do with your seeking.
So, anyway, I think that to come around this, why are you here, is not a question that necessarily involves the real. And it is not impossible to answer. It is impossible to answer what is your desire by structure, by linguistic structure. Okay, now, why you're here is something that links to desire in as much as it has to do with the cause. And that's in that realm it comes closer. Now another hand had been up. EU. Okay.
Oh, sorry, no, I was thinking, well, I said, in 10 actually got me thinking, of course, in the 10 seminar on anxiety, called Anxiety, that was just published last year, he describes anxiety as being not something like fear without object, but fear of the real. Sort of fun things, sort of this whole thing. And he describes anxiety as being the feeling of a barrier that you are slipping away. So if I say, you know, that's what I've seen the future, and your life is going to come to nothing, and you get mad at me, but you don't really feel anxiety about that. If I say, I've seen the future, and your life comes to nothing unless you make the right choice tomorrow, then the moment that you feel that barrier slipping away, that's when anxiety happens. So Lacan sort of developed this idea that what we're doing when we put
anxiety, we're trying to put that barrier back in place to guard against access to
That's an interesting take. We tend to think of anguish in a perhaps more epistemic realm. First of all, is one of the it's an affect that is very particular among all the affects, yeah, that you can think of. Anxiety is very, very unique in the sense that it doesn't displace. And since it doesn't displace, it doesn't lie. Lacan says. It's the only affect that doesn't lie. That's the phrase. And he speaks of it as the affect that emerges in the encounter with the real. And also, later on, 5 years later, after 1968, in 1968, in the Psychoanalytic Act, speaks of anxiety as an affect that somewhat, in the Freudian sense, in the change of the anguish theory in Freud, first theory was caused by repression, and later he changes the theory. Following that, Lacan takes this as anguish being the signal or the preparatory affect of the moments before an act. The example he gives is Julius Caesar before he crosses the Rubicon. And this dream, anguishing dream, terrible dream about the next step he was about to take, with the sense for him of penetrating motherland, nonetheless. So, in that sense, it is an act that was preponderant for humankind, in fact. So, anguish is an affect that becomes or acquires an epistemic sense, something that quickly is linked to an act, to the previous stages of an act. So, again, it's something that has a knowledge, like you were saying earlier, that is not articulable. Yet, it is something that is very much in the process of an analysis. It changes. Yeah. At first, for example, when somebody was talking about the panic attack of Soprano, in the state of anguish, the subject wants to know nothing of it. He just wants it to pass. After, we may have, I don't know, sadness, depression, whatever other affect, and a working through. But in the instant of anguish, there is really no. It's first of all just an instant, and I think we can all agree that it's probably wish to be very quick.
Excuse me, we've got, it's 8:30, we're not gonna take a break, obviously. I know you chided me, said, well, how can they go this long with only a 5-minute break?
No, it's okay.
Okay, but we're not gonna take a break, but we're gonna go about 20 minutes. If we could just shift the conversation in, and again, this is a free-for-all, that's what it should be. That's how a cartel operates, but I really want to get into the question of the thing, because this is so key. I mean, the thing, language, it's a it's very important philosophical question. I don't want to review, Kant, his reference to Kant, the thing in itself, and, reality. We always tend to think of the thing, dusting, his linguistic points and so forth. But he's talking about thing, and he's talking about representation, and he's talking about language. And rather than unpack these philosophically, I'd like to ask a different question. What do you desire? But what's your thing?
But that's an even more impossible question.
Well, that's why I asked it, you know. Yeah.
I mean, my interpretation at this juncture is that thinking is, it's like the irreducible presence. It is the assertion of, and that's like a Cartesian thing to say, right? It's like the enactment of the self in a certain way. But I guess I wonder at this point, it's like, so for instance, like when you're trying to meditate, you try to expand the space in between your thoughts in the hope that, I guess, that you'll come to some greater truth when thinking's not there. So I guess you can't reduce it to just being, you know, an assertion of your own presence, because even when you're not thinking, it's the unconscious, you're still thinking in a certain way. So I don't know.
But it's you and you're not there. I mean,
It's
again, he's got his little kind of
effacing.
aphoristic formulation where it's always, it's that which is beyond the signified. So there's always that, in a sense, it's something that's always there, but it's always escaping the signified and so forth. But you know, the signified is constant chasing it. So I mean, it's like but at the same time, it has to do with the real. You know, so you know, and he talks at one point, it's very interesting, about the mother. You know, I mean, you know, incest, you know, and the law and so forth. I mean, it's like that. He goes back to the etymology of Das Ding in the old German. Is like sort of a council coming together, you know, to enact law. That's, I guess, what it meant in Salic law, and so forth. So it's this. I don't know if you, again, keep bringing up HBO movies to illustrate the point here, but did you really watch the one on the Norseman? You know, they're always, whenever the guy who's, I can't remember what his name is, Thor or whatever it is, you know, the big, you know, Norseman is kind of he's got issues, and you know, he's always getting all the council together, you know, all, you know, heavy in their fur, their skins, and you know, with their swords, and you know,
Vikings you're talking about?
yeah, the Vikings, yeah. And you know, and sometimes they say, you know, kill him or something like that, you know, and so forth. But you know, so that's when I was reading his account of Das Ding, I was thinking, well, that's kind of what comes to mind. So I mean, there's pleasure seeking, but there's also anxiety, and there's this kind of council going on, this assembly of deliberation, which, you know, within subjective realm, you know, is going on within that space that we call the I, and so forth. But it's not just the I that's relating to something that is not I. This is not Hegelian. I mean, it's this kind of assemblage of different discourses, and it's all part of this kind of coming to a resolution, which is what he said. He ties it to the pleasure principle. I don't know. Do you have some thoughts on this? You know,
On the thing.
yeah, I'm saying in terms, and not so much philosophically, it's in terms of how this really works in terms of analysis.
In analysis, that's something that you can maybe better. But I think that if you want to, say, describe or define the thing as the way that Lacan talks about it.
I don't want to define it.
No, but in the way that, if you want to understand it in the way that Lacan talks about it, I would say the best way to understand it is that object which is impossible to be represented by something else or substituted by something else. But, you know, in Freudian theory, when he talks about a drive, he says the most interchangeable thing, most non-constant thing, is the object. I can love this person, and the next, but I can also love another person.
Sure.
There's always, I mean, everything. I can drink water, but I can also have a Coke. The object of what I desire is interchangeable. The thing is the non-interchangeable. Is the unique object par excellence. That's why he says about sublimation, it is about elevating the object to the work of art. the work of art or to making it into the thing. It cannot be substituted by something else. And our desire is aimed at that. And now the problem is, why is that specific object not substitutable? And that's a difficult thing, because if I were a Minnesota, talks about Minnesota, medieval bards who sing of the beautiful lady. Well, obviously, this lady with capital L cannot be substituted by another lady. But to say what exactly it is in that lady that makes her in that specific unique object that cannot be substituted, that's an impossible question. Yeah. Same thing for Antigone, who wants to bury her dead brother. She wants to bury a corpse. Yeah? 80 pounds of meat.
Yeah.
80 pounds of meat.
Well, that
And she
was
has,
quite-
and she dies for it. Yeah. And she suffers for it. And she, that's the tragedy. What is so important in burying that dead body of the brother? Of how many brothers? How many kilos that meat? But that is the thing. That which at a certain moment or a certain context cannot be substituted and cannot be abandoned. I think that's the best way to
Yes.
and I think if you think about it in this way, you can, I think, more or less understand what the thing is.
Yeah.
It's not something actually. It's not something you can point at. Yeah. But it can be incorporated.
Is this unsubstitutability, this is because this is why the thing is not located in symbolic. The thing isn't symbolic because in the symbolic there's this chain of like the way that this play of signifiers the pleasure principle.
Yeah.
So like the thing is related to or in order.
Yeah.
Because it's like always in its place, but you can't ever quite get at it, right? Like he talks about it, the network has to be surrounded.
Yeah.
Like when you raise the object to the dignity of the thing, it has to be surrounded by a network of, it's like Zile or something like that, aims in German. You just, I missed the second hour. I had something else that I had to do, sorry, but I love to talk about the
Yeah, but it's
around.
exactly this. If we would try to, every one of us try to describe why we fell in love with the person that we fell in love with, we end up in, you can articulate it endlessly. Beautiful blonde hair, beautiful blue eyes. Yes and no, because there are so many people with beautiful blonde hair and blue eyes. And you can go on and on and on and on. You will always circle around the thing.
Right, so those are
The
all
one
objective
thing that
things.
makes this person.
Yeah. You never reach the subject of that person.
You never reach.
It's sort of be this, the other, the thing, the neighbor.
I think it's easier to think about it in a Kantian sense, perhaps, like the thing in itself.
Right, he
Not
takes,
available.
he takes that thing from Kant, right? He's getting that.
But he does,
Yeah.
but
Freud, actually,
but in Kant,
Okay, yeah.
the thing in itself is what philosophers call a limiting concept. It means it's the bounds of representation. We can't talk beyond the representation. And this is why somebody like Hegel and a lot of 20th century philosophers say, well, this is ridiculous, this Kantian notion of the thing in itself. How can you talk about a thing in itself that you can't talk about? And why even have it? That was actually Hegel's point, his critique of Kant. But that's not what's going on with Lacan here. It's not what the Germans call a Jenseits. It's not always on the other side of it. It's not.
Well, there is this thing of it's funny because when you say how can you talk about it, something that you can't really talk about. Lacan used to make a play on words, very usual in his style. Just came to mind now. He said about, so the French word for couch is divan, and he used to speak of a certain need, something that is inherent to the process of analysis. There is a certain dir van, which is the same vein, or to put it in plain English and part of my French, to shoot the shit a little. Yeah, this is necessary. To beat around the bush is necessary because that is circumscribing it, is the best attainment that you can have. Right?
So even if you can't define the thing, you can talk about it.
Correct.
Yeah,
Yes.
you talk around and so forth, yeah.
Yeah, because
Going
you're
round and
always,
round.
yeah.
Going round and round,
But
exactly.
you talk about it. You
Yes.
talk-
and you
Only
do that
the
because,
definition.
You don't say it, you talk about it. Yes.
and you do that because you're drawn to it.
That's
You
why
keep circling back.
I think it's a difference, a very huge difference, at least for me, if you talk, that if you don't talk, if you keep silent, it's not the same. Because even if you can't say your desire, because it's something that can be said by words, perhaps the only way of reading something about the desire is when you talk.
Right.
Not exactly in what you say. You can say, well, mostly everything. But in that process of talking, we can read the desire.
Well,
So going back,
take the familiar trope of the elephant in the room. You know, the elephant that you can't speak about is
Right.
there. And the more you talk about it, you know, you sort of know that elephant's in the room, but you don't really know it because you don't speak about it.
So I'm going to translate that because these guys are Argentinians and we don't have such a saying. Hay un dicho, there's a saying in English that is sort of like, es como el elefante dentro de la habitación del que no se puede hablar.
Lacan uses that in seminar 1, that and at the end of the seminar he
The elephant of the room.
yes,
Yes.
give away like a draw of an elephant to everyone.
He did.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
It's like a photocopy
Sure.
of an elephant to everyone. Yeah. Well,
Nice.
Yeah,
We
I mean,
cannot talk
in
about
some
that,
way
but
that is
it exists.
the thing. Yeah,
it would be something like that. Okay, you cannot talk about the desire, but because you are here and you talk, there is a desire, and we know that.
Right.
So the answer is inact.
Yeah.
That was what you were saying.
Right.
That is what
You know, and also at Heidegger, you know, who Lacan is very much influenced by. In fact, I have a PhD student who's about to turn his dissertation on Heidegger and Lacan. But there's this whole notion of the unsaid, you know, but you can't talk about the unsaid other than the said that constantly is going on. So I mean, it's this constant circling, this constant motion, this constant enchaining of the signifiers, you know, which is what is going on in analysis and so forth. And you talked about presence before. It's a presence, but it's a presence that can't really be named, but it's a presence that's not an absence either. No.
It's felt. It's felt very quickly in analysis against the myth of, and we will talk about that a little tomorrow when we present the book, this myths of analysis of being something very deep, very long and very costly. Since it is about speaking, it is as superficial as discourse. It floats in the surface of discourse. So you can hear the unconscious clearly in discourse.
But not just, it doesn't have to be intelligible speech, does it?
No, precisely the
Right.
opposite. Free association is an invitation to be as incoherent as possible,
Right.
if you
Right.
may. It doesn't matter what you say, it
Right.
matters that you don't choose what to say. Just
Remember
say.
that when you start getting all gooey about phenomenology.
Remember when you start analysis over here, I don't know, you might be at your own risk on that one. But yeah, there is, I think, a certain realm of the experience of saying in analysis that it's very interesting because we invite analyzants to speak as freely as possible. Yet we know from the limitations of language and its structure that the division is part of the equation, yeah? So that we are divided between thinking and speaking. And so in this sense, the invitation is somewhat to trip. It's an invitation to trip on those pebbles that bug you in the shoe always in the same way. It's not about big stuff. It's about what insists always in the same place.
it's not just what you say, but the position that you have in what you are saying.
Correct. The enunciation. Yeah.
That's right.
What do you guys think? And now I'm going to close the cartel, yeah? May I? May I take the
We got
closure?
about 5.
Voila. So what do you think of this mess we just done here? Honestly, huh? Like I as Dominique was saying, it's very important for us to hear you say, because for us this is not to come here and demonstrate our knowledge. Much on the contrary, is to show you how much we lack. If not, we wouldn't teach you a thing. So where are we standing?
Go ahead.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I was honestly really confused by the reading, but, and this is like my very first introduction to Lacan,
Yeah.
not via Zizek, so.
Good.
Yeah, so anyway, it just kind of reminds me of like the Myers-Briggs tests that people do on like Facebook, you know, or whatever. It's like you trying to figure out what kind of a person you are.
Oh.
But it seems to me that whenever someone fills that out, it's always the person that they want to be. You know, it's never like actually who they are. And anyone who actually looks at, what's that?
It's on Facebook already, the idealized. So,
Yeah, okay, fair enough. But I mean, like, you're supposed- like, now you're like saying, this is me. I'm this guy or woman. And so, so it seems to me like it's kind of like this, what is it that when someone looks at that Myers-Briggs test and says, well, that's total bullshit, and then like there's something else, they're starting to see some other like, what is it that's underneath that, or like, I don't know, does that sound?
Yes, the idea, I guess the idea that sustains psychoanalysis is that something speaks in spite of you. That speaks.
Yeah, it
So-
betrays you, so to speak.
Yeah. So sometimes it betrays you, and sometimes it actually surprises you. Sometimes some slips are very useful.
Yeah. You are always going to say more than what you want to say.
Yeah.
Always.
The intentions will always be falling short in that sense. So yeah, you're very much on track. You know, so not as confused. Hopefully.
Okay.
Let's see if we can hear somebody who we haven't heard from tonight about wants to speak for mass.
I'll say something. It'll probably be brief. The whole lecture has me thinking about, because we've done a lot of avoiding and talked a lot about avoidance. And I've done a lot of avoiding, but I haven't spoken. And so I think like the question is, what is like this elephant in the room question, like what is produced via avoidance is like kind of like what I've been thinking about, just circling around the whole time.
So in a way, avoidance points as much as non-avoiding.
Right, like you said, you always say more than you want to say.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm gonna please stop the recording of this here, and I have a few housekeeping things I want to just get to, so don't run off yet.